Hey adventurer, welcome back to The Weary Wanderer. Tonight we're taking a journey, not through treacherous mountains or across storm-tossed seas, but into the dark, claustrophobic heart of a New England village gripped by madness. We're heading to Salem, 1692, to explore exactly why the single most terrifying travel experience imaginable was the short walk from your own front door to the inside of a magistrate's jail cell. We're here to understand precisely why it profoundly, biblically, and systemically sucked to be a woman accused of witchcraft. You've seen the paintings, you've read the plays. The woman accused of witchcraft. A figure of Gothic horror, sometimes depicted as a cackling crone over a cauldron, other times as a tragic, romantic heroine, a martyr for reason in an age of superstition. She is a powerful symbol, a character, a plot device. But let's be brutally clear. Being a real woman in Salem, Massachusetts, in the year of our Lord 1692, and hearing your name cried out in connection with the devil, was nothing like a story. It wasn't romantic, and it certainly wasn't symbolic. It was a bureaucratic, neighbor-fueled, spiritually sanctioned nightmare. It was a terrifying, bewildering, and soul-crushing experience, and for the vast majority of people who lived it, it profoundly sucked. We're going to peel back the layers of myth and dramatic license to get at the cold, hard, miserable truth of the matter. We'll explore the world she lived in, the sheer physical discomfort of 17th century life that was her daily reality before the accusations even began. We'll examine the terrifying circular logic of the trials themselves, the psychology of the accusers and the accused, and the utter, abject powerlessness of being caught in a machine fueled by fear, jealousy, and bad bread. Before we're dragged kicking and screaming before the magistrates, if you find this kind of deep dive into historical misery strangely compelling, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to The Weary Wanderer. It lets the algorithm know that there's a place for stories about the unsung, the unglorious, and the profoundly unlucky. And let me know in the comments below what other historical roles you think get a bit too much of a romantic gloss over. Your suggestions are the lifeblood of this channel. All right. Now find a comfortable spot. A true luxury our accused woman was about to be permanently denied. Perhaps pour yourself a drink of clean, potable water. Another amenity she would soon be praying for. Let the modern world fade away for a moment. We need to understand the world we are about to lose before it is ripped away from us. We need to step into the shoes of a woman in colonial New England. A woman who has no idea that she is about to become a household name for all the worst reasons in history. You weren't born a witch. You were born a woman. And in colonial New England in the late 17th century, that was already a life sentence of hard labor. You weren't so much born as you were conscripted into the family unit, another set of hands for the endless Sisyphean task of carving a life out of a harsh and unforgiving landscape. There was no welcoming committee, no gender reveal party with pink smoke. There was just the grim, utilitarian assessment of another mouth to feed, and God willing, another body to help with the work. Your world from birth was small, circumscribed by the farmstead, the village, and the church. Your destiny was not a matter of choice or ambition. It was a path worn deep into the muddy ground by the generations of women who came before you. It was a life of submission. Submission to your father, submission to your husband, submission to the ironclad will of God and his earthly interpreters, the ministers in their stark, black pulpits. Your calling wasn't to be a witch. Your calling was to be a wife, a mother, a worker, to be forgotten by history, buried under a simple, now illegible stone in the churchyard. The fact that we are talking about you at all means something has already gone terribly, terribly wrong. Let's imagine you then, not as a historical caricature, but as a person. Perhaps you are Sarah Good, a beggar and a social outcast. your life already a litany of hardship. Or perhaps you are Rebecca Nurse, a respected, elderly matriarch of 71, known for her piety and good standing. Or maybe you are Bridget Bishop, a tavern keeper who likes to wear a red bodice and has a reputation for being a little too sharp-tongued and worldly for her neighbor's comfort. For our purposes, let's step into a life that is a composite of these faiths. A woman of middle years, let's call her Eleanor. Married, with a handful of children, a small plot of land, and a life defined by a rhythm as predictable as the rising sun and the chiming of the church bell. Your training for this life began the moment you could walk. While a modern child's world is cushioned with plastic toys and padded corners, your playground was the packed dirt floor of the family home and the rock-strewn yard outside. Your toys were not dolls and games, but rudimentary smaller versions of the tools you would wield for the rest of your life. A tiny broom to sweep the hearth, a little pail to practice fetching water, a blunt needle to learn the endless, thankless task of mending rough-spun cloth. Fun games included Don't Die of Dysentery, Find the Slightly Less Weevil-Infested Grain, and the ever-popular winter pastime, Let's Huddle Together and Try Not to Freeze to Death. By the age of 6 or 7, you were already a vital part of the family's economic engine. You weren't cheap, expendable labor. You were essential, unpaid labor. You learned to spin thread, a task that would occupy countless hours of your life, your fingers growing calloused and nimble. You learned to churn butter until your arms ached, with a fire that never quite left. You learned to watch the younger children, your own childhood curtailed to facilitate the survival of the next generation. You mastered the grim skills of plucking a chicken, salting pork, and identifying which of the wild greens wouldn't kill you. This was your education. Not in letters or philosophy, but in the brutal calculus of survival. And here, in this daily grind, we can find that flicker of light, the world that will be lost. There was a profound, unspoken satisfaction in it, at times. The awe-inspiring part of your life wasn't some grand vista. It was the small, hard-won victories. It was the sight of perfectly stacked firewood, a bulwark against the coming winter's killing cold. It was the warm, earthy smell of baking bread, a smell that meant, for today at least, no one would go hungry. It was the simple, profound beauty of a New England autumn, the sugar maples turning a fiery, defiant red against a crisp blue sky, a spectacle of divine artistry that even the most stoic Puritan heart had to acknowledge. It was the quiet pride of seeing a perfectly stitched seam, a small act of order and creation in a world that constantly threatened to descend into chaos. Your primary instructor in this school of hard knocks was your mother, a woman whose face was likely a roadmap of hardship, her features weathered and worn like an old stone wall. Her hands were her testament, gnarled and powerful, capable of both comforting a feverish child and wringing a chicken's neck with equal, unsentimental efficiency. She taught you everything not through patient explanation, but through repetition and terse correction. More wood for the fire. The soap needs more lye. Mind the pot. Her approval was a rare and precious currency, never offered lightly. A simple, "that will do," from her was the equivalent of a modern-day standing ovation. And there was your father, and later your husband. A man who smelled of sweat, soil, and wood smoke. His world was the fields, the forest, the barn. His relationship with you was one of ownership and duty. He was the head of the household, the spiritual authority, the one who led the family in prayer each morning and each night. His was a world of back-breaking labor, clearing stones from fields that seemed to grow them anew each spring, felling ancient trees with nothing but an axe and raw muscle, his body a testament to a life of constant grinding effort. Yet, even in this stern, patriarchal world, there were moments of unguarded humanity. The rare, gruff smile from your husband when you brought him a pail of cool water in the high summer heat. the way your children would cling to your skirts, their small hands a reminder of the purpose of all this toil, the shared moments of community, the barn raisings or husking bees, where for a brief afternoon, the burden of survival was shared. Laughter, when it came, was a rare, precious thing, but it existed. It echoed in the firelight during a winter storm, a brief human defiance against the howling wind and the ever-present fear of the wilderness, both the one outside your door and the one the preacher warned you about inside your own soul. This was your life, a constant, exhausting, and often thankless cycle of work, prayer, and child-rearing. It was a life lived on the knife's edge of survival, where a bad harvest, a harsh winter, or a sudden sickness could mean catastrophe. You were not a witch. You were a pillar of this small, fragile society. You were a maintainer of the flame, a creator of life, a weaver of threads both literal and familial. You were a woman named Eleanor, and your world, for all its profound and unending suck, was whole. It was yours, and you had no earthly idea that it was all about to be consumed by fire. Holidays, paid leave, the very concept of a weekend. These are adorable, futuristic fantasies. For Eleanor, our 17th century woman, the only calendar that mattered was the one dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the insatiable demands of a hungry family. The rhythm of life wasn't a gentle waltz. It was a forced march, and the beat was relentless. A day in her life wasn't a series of choices. It was a preordained list of labors, each one as non-negotiable as gravity. A day did not begin with the gentle chirping of birds or the soft glow of dawn filtering through a clean window. It began in the oppressive pitch-black cold, often hours before the sun could be bothered to show up for its shift. The first sensation wasn't one of peaceful awakening, but the bone-deep chill of a room that had lost its brief war with the night. The first sound wasn't a pleasant alarm, but the sharp cry of a hungry infant, an immediate and non-cancelable meeting request from the smallest member of the household, your bed, a lumpy sack of straw or corn husks that you likely shared with your husband and a couple of the smaller children, offered no comfort, only the familiar geography of aches and pains. Rising wasn't an option. It was a summons. The first and most critical task, the one upon which all other survival depended, was the resurrection of the fire. The hearth was the heart of the home, but it was a tyrannical, demanding organ. In the morning, it was a cold pit of gray ash and despair. Your job was to coax it back to life. You'd kneel on the cold stone, your breath pluming in the air, carefully tending to the faint glow of the embers you'd buried the night before. You'd blow on them, your cheeks aching, feeding the nascent flame delicate slivers of kindling, like a priestess making an offering to a very grumpy god. When it finally caught, it wasn't a moment of cozy triumph. It was a stay of execution. You had defeated the cold for now. That fire would not be left alone for the rest of the day. It was another child, one that consumed wood instead of milk, and would burn the house down if you turned your back on it for too long. With the fire established, it was time for the morning's culinary adventure, breakfast. This was not a meal for pleasure, it was a fueling operation. The menu was stark and brutally consistent. The star of the show was usually a pottage or a gruel. Imagine a porridge made of cornmeal or oats, boiled with water until it formed a thick, vaguely warm slurry. Sometimes, for a bit of excitement, you might throw in some leftovers from last night's meal, creating a thrilling mystery porridge. Was that a bit of turnip? Or a piece of salt pork that has achieved the texture of a fossil? This would be accompanied by bread, but not the light, airy bread of modern bakeries. This was bread that could double as a building material. Dense, coarse, made with rye or rough-milled wheat, it was built for endurance, not enjoyment. Eating it was a conscious act of chewing. And to wash it all down? Water, hauled by hand from the well or stream, tasting faintly of earth and whatever bacteria were thriving in it that week. Or perhaps some small beer, a low-alcohol brew that was safer than water, but had all the refreshing zest of watery toast. You ate, not because it was delicious, but because if you didn't, you would collapse by midday. Then, as the weak morning light finally illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, the real work began. The day was a carousel of ceaseless, physically demanding tasks. If it was churning day, you'd spend hours plunging a wooden dasher up and down in a crock of cream, an act of such profound monotony that your mind would go numb. Your arm would burn, then ache, then burn again, until the miraculous moment the butter finally came. The satisfaction of this was immediately undercut by the knowledge that you'd have to do it all again in a few days. Or perhaps it was spinning day. You'd sit at the wheel, the rhythmic whirring sound becoming the soundtrack to your life, feeding tufts of wool or flax onto the spindle, transforming a chaotic mass into a single, orderly thread. It was an endless task. The family's need for cloth was as constant as their need for food. You spun and spun, your mind wandering, your fingers working on instinct, making the literal thread that held your world together. And let's not forget the environment, which was not a passive backdrop, but an active antagonist. The glorious New England nature you see on postcards was, for Eleanor, a daily opponent. In the summer, the sun wasn't a gentle warmth. It was a celestial blacksmith's forge, beating down relentlessly. The humidity was a physical weight, a damp, suffocating blanket that made every movement a struggle and ensured your rough-spun clothes were permanently glued to your skin with sweat. And the insects. Oh, the insects. Black flies, mosquitoes, deer flies. A buzzing, biting confederacy of tiny airborne sadists that seemed to view humans as a personal mobile buffet. Winter was no better. The wind wasn't a refreshing breeze. It was a howling, shrieking entity. A physical force that seemed determined to peel the very clapboards from the house. It was the icy exhalation from the lungs of a frozen god, finding every single crack in your home's construction and turning your living space into a drafty approximation of a cave. The cold wasn't just a temperature, it was a predator, silently stalking, seeping into your bones, threatening your children, and making the simple act of stepping outside a calculated risk, and the sensory experience of it all. Let's talk about the smells. The dominant scent of your life was wood smoke, a fragrance that permeated your clothes, your hair, your very skin. But this was layered with a complex bouquet of other, less charming aromas. The sharp tang of boiling cabbage, the sour scent of unwashed bodies, the ever-present earthy smell of the chamber pot in the corner, the faint but persistent odor of manure from the barn, and the greasy animal smell of tallow, if it was candle-making day. Your home was an olfactory record of everything required to stay alive. The sounds were a symphony of suffering, the relentless crying of the baby, the bleating of a goat, the squealing of the pig, the hacking cough of a child with a chest cold, the endless thump 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 of the butter churn, the monotonous whir of the spinning wheel, the creak and groan of the house settling. Silence was a rare and suspicious commodity. Through all this, you were also a mother. You were breaking up fights between siblings, wiping noses, cleaning up messes that defy modern description, and keeping a terrified eye on the toddler who viewed the open hearth as a fascinating, glowing portal to another dimension. You did all this while cooking, cleaning, mending, and manufacturing household goods from scratch. You were a factory, a daycare, a pharmacy, and a short-order cook, all wrapped in one perpetually exhausted package. As evening approached, the work simply changed its nature. You'd prepare the evening meal, a thrilling sequel to breakfast, often featuring the very same pottage, now with a few more hours of simmering under its belt. You'd call the family in from the fields, their bodies caked with the day's grime. After the meal, there were more chores, mending torn clothes by the flickering, inadequate light of a tallow candle, a task that was murder on the eyes, banking the fire for the night, a final weary trip to the barn to check on the animals. The day would end as it began, in prayer. Your husband would lead the family, his voice a low drone, reading from the Bible, reminding everyone of God's power, their own sinfulness, and the eternal damnation that awaited the wicked. It was meant to be a comfort, but it often felt like one last item on a checklist of duties, a final spiritual accounting before collapsing into a sleep that was less about rest and more about a temporary cessation of labor before the entire unforgiving cycle began all over again. This was a good day, a normal day, a day where no one got sick, nothing broke, and the food supply was adequate. This baseline of grinding, relentless, soul-crushing toil was the foundation of your entire existence. And it is absolutely vital to understand this, because the horror that was coming was not going to replace this life. It was going to be piled directly on top of it. In our age of smart homes, voice assistants, and appliances that politely apologize for being offline, it's easy to romanticize the simple tools of the past. We picture a rustic, handcrafted world of beautiful, functional objects. This is a lie. A beautiful, Instagram-filtered lie. Eleanor's home was also a smart home, in that you had to be incredibly smart, vigilant, and perpetually on edge to prevent it and its contents from actively trying to maim you, starve you, or burn you to the ground. Her tools were not cheerful helpers. They were sullen, uncooperative employees, and her relationship with them was an unholy matrimony of absolute dependence and profound resentment. Let's begin with the heart of the home, the fireplace. This wasn't a charming brick-lined nook for gathering and singing carols. It was a gaping, smoky maw, a ravenous beast that demanded constant tribute of wood. Its primary function was heat, but its secondary and far more successful function was to fill the small, poorly ventilated house with a constant haze of eye-watering, lung-blackening smoke. The chimney, a crude affair of sticks and clay, was less a marvel of engineering and more a suggestion to the smoke about the general direction of up. It frequently failed. This meant living in a perpetual state of feeling like you were being slow-cooked in a smoker, which in a way you were. Furthermore, this open fire was a pyromaniac's dream. It would greedily spit hot embers onto the wooden floorboards, the straw bedding, or the hem of your own highly flammable dress. Part of your daily routine was being an amateur fire marshal, constantly vigilant for the spark that could incinerate your entire existence. Hanging precariously over this pit of fire and smoke was the cauldron. A hulking cast-iron beast, it weighed a literal ton and was usually suspended from a lug pole or a crude iron crane. This meant that every interaction with the day's pottage involved leaning directly over an open flame to wrestle with a pot of boiling hot despair. The whole setup had the stability of a Jenga tower in an earthquake. A moment of inattention, a snagged sleeve, and the entire family's dinner, the product of hours of labor, could be instantly converted into a floor-searing, foot-scalding catastrophe. Then we have the instruments of domestic production, the machines that turned raw materials into usable goods. The spinning wheel, that quaint symbol of colonial domesticity, was in reality a small wooden tyrant. It demanded your undivided attention. Its drive band, a simple cord, had a preternatural ability to snap at the most inconvenient moment. The whirl would get gummed up. The spindle would snag the thread you'd just spent 10 minutes painstakingly thinning out. Its constant, monotonous whir-whir-whir was the sound of your life force being slowly spooled into thread, a sound that would probably echo in your nightmares, if you weren't too exhausted to dream. The butter churn was even worse. It was less a tool and more a medieval instrument of punishment. Its sole purpose was to resist your efforts for as long as humanly possible. The wooden dasher was heavy. The cream would splash and slop. The wood of the churn itself could harbor bacteria that would sour the whole batch, wasting precious cream and hours of arm-shattering labor. You'd plunge that dasher up and down, feeling the burn creep up your shoulder, staring at the wall, wondering if this was all some sort of cosmic joke. The churn's personality was one of stubborn, passive-aggressive defiance. It would only yield the butter when it was good and ready, and not a moment sooner, as if to remind you who was truly in charge. And what about your state-of-the-art personal protective equipment? It consisted primarily of a long, heavy dress of linen or wool, an apron, and a linen cap. This ensemble offered about as much protection from the daily hazards of your life as a strongly worded suggestion. The apron, your main line of defense, was a single piece of cloth standing between you and a splash of boiling water, a glob of hot grease, or the ever-present filth of the floor. Your shoes were slabs of stiff, ill-fitting leather that were in a constant state of being either damp, caked in mud, or both. They didn't cushion your feet, they encased them. Every step was a dull thud, a reminder of your connection to the cold, hard earth. The house itself was the biggest, most flawed tool of all. Forget the cozy cottage aesthetic. Your house was a wooden box, locked in a perpetual and losing battle with the New England climate. The walls, perhaps insulated with a charming mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung, were a roadmap of drafts. The roof, likely thatched or covered in rough-hewn shingles, was less a piece of architecture and more a multi-species high-rise apartment building that you just happened to live under. It was home to mice, rats, squirrels, birds, and an entire civilization of insects, all of whom regarded your living space as their personal pantry and latrine. And it leaked. Oh, it leaked. A heavy rainstorm meant the exciting game of Find the Drip, where you'd strategically place every bucket, pail, and pot you owned to catch the streams of brown water trickling down, each drop a tiny, mocking reminder of the roof's and your own abject failure to achieve a dry existence. And yet, despite this daily catalog of failures, betrayals, and general unhelpfulness, these tools were your life. You cursed them, you fought them, but you also cared for them. You spent precious time sharpening the knife that was never quite sharp enough, reseating the axe handle that always worked itself loose, patching the leaky bellows, and scrubbing the sullen cauldron. You had to. They were extensions of your own will, the only things standing between your family and the howling wilderness. It was an unholy matrimony, a bond forged not in love or convenience, but in shared misery and mutual disrespect. And this constant, frustrating, and dangerous relationship with the very objects of your world was just another layer of the unending psychological and physical grind. We have built a picture of Eleanor's life as a relentless series of labors performed with unreliable tools in a hostile environment. Now we must discuss the bill for all that work. The human body is a resilient and adaptable machine, but it keeps a meticulous ledger of every hardship, every injury, every moment of deprivation. And in the 17th century, that bill came due with shocking speed and brutal interest. The modern concept of reaching your prime at 30 or 40 would have been laughably absurd to Eleanor. By the time a pampered Boston merchant's wife might be considered in her bloom, Eleanor's body was already a living museum of occupational hazards, a testament to a life spent in a state of low-grade warfare with her surroundings. Let's begin with the framework itself. Her spine, by the age of 35, likely resembled a gnarled oak branch, more than a human spinal column. Decades of bending over a low hearth, hauling heavy buckets of water from the well, lifting squirming children, and stooping in the garden, had compressed and twisted it into a permanent state of complaint. Her joints, particularly her knees and hips, would sing arias of agony with every change in the weather, a more reliable almanac than any printed pamphlet. Arthritis wasn't a condition of old age. It was a constant, unwelcome companion to middle age, a fiery reminder of every heavy load she'd ever lifted. And her hands, oh, her magnificent, ruined hands. They were not the soft, gentle hands of poetry. They were tools, less flesh and blood, more gnarled root and hardened callus. They were a roadmap of her life, etched with the silvery scars of countless knife slips, dotted with the puckered memory of burns from the hearth, the skin permanently cracked and raw from harsh lye soap and cold water. A splinter wasn't a minor annoyance to be tweezed out. It was a potential crisis, a likely source of an infection that could swell her hand to a useless, throbbing club. Then there was the matter of her teeth. Dental hygiene was a concept as foreign as the moon. The diet, while coarse, was also full of gritty starches. The result was a predictable and painful decline. Dental care consisted of two main strategies: endure the throbbing, soul-stealing agony of an abscessed tooth for weeks on end, or, if it became truly unbearable, go to the blacksmith. He was the closest thing she had to a dentist, and his primary technique involved a stiff drink of rum, for the patient hopefully, a pair of rusty pliers, and a great deal of unanesthetized violence. By her middle years, a full set of teeth was a rarity, and chronic oral pain was just another part of the daily sensory landscape. And we cannot ignore the immense, life-threatening toll of her primary biological function: childbirth. In an age without antiseptics, antibiotics, or modern obstetric knowledge, every single pregnancy was a walk through the valley of the shadow of death. The act of giving birth on a straw mattress in a drafty, unclean room was a gamble with fate. Infection, hemorrhage, and exhaustion were common killers. For those who survived, the physical cost was immense: prolapsed organs, torn tissues that never healed properly, and the sheer depletion of a body pushed to its absolute limit, time and time again. This wasn't the celebrated miracle of life. It was a terrifying, bloody, and often fatal duty. But it wasn't just the spectacular injuries or the slow, grinding decay of her skeleton that wore her down. Oh no. Her lifestyle was a prolific distributor of fascinating internal afflictions. Her lungs, after years of breathing in wood smoke in a poorly ventilated cabin, were likely in a state of perpetual irritation. The winter cough was an annual visitor that often decided to take up permanent residence. And the food and water, as we've noted, were a bacterial free-for-all. Dysentery, known grimly as the bloody flux, was a terrifyingly common and often lethal ailment that could sweep through a village, leaving a trail of death and dehydration. It was a frequent and violently unwelcome houseguest. All of this was layered on top of a baseline of profound, bone-deep exhaustion. This wasn't the kind of tiredness you can fix with a good night's sleep and a strong cup of coffee. This was a form of spiritual and physical debt that compounded daily, a weariness so profound it felt as though it had settled in her marrow. Sleep was just a pause, never a reset. She woke up tired and went to bed exhausted, every single day. While her body was engaged in this constant losing battle, her mind was fighting its own silent war. The first enemy was fear. Her existence was precarious, and anxiety was the air she breathed. It was the fear of a child's cough turning into a fatal fever, the fear of a dry summer leading to a failed harvest, and a winter of starvation, the fear of the still vast wilderness that surrounded their tiny pocket of civilization, and the very real threat of attack, and above all, the fear of God, a righteous, terrifying God who saw every failing and judged every soul with unforgiving severity. Fear wasn't an occasional spike of adrenaline. It was the background static of her entire life. Then there was the sheer, soul-crushing monotony. The days, the weeks, the seasons bled into one another in a relentless cycle of the same chores, the same foods, the same struggles. Her life path was not her own to choose. Her will was a tiny boat in a vast, indifferent ocean, tossed about by the currents of her husband's decisions, the minister's dictates, and the season's demands. She had almost no agency, no control over the grand trajectory of her own life. This created a profound sense of being trapped, a psychological cage built of duty and necessity. Her inner world likely became a fortress of stoic resignation, the walls built of prayer and pragmatism. She learned to swallow anger, to bury grief, to push past despair because the alternative was to collapse, and collapse was not an option. The work still had to be done. The children still had to be fed. Her spirit, if it could be said to have any room to breathe, survived on tiny, fleeting scraps of grace. The brief, uncomplicated joy of a child's laugh. The profound, silent beauty of a field of wheat turning gold in the late afternoon sun. A shared, dark joke with another woman at the well. A moment of unspoken, mutual understanding of their shared, absurd predicament. This was Eleanor's normal, a body in slow decay, a mind under permanent siege. She was worn down, depleted, and stretched taut as a drum. She was a tinderbox of quiet desperation, waiting for a spark, and that spark was about to be struck. Travel rarely happens in a vacuum, and the journey through a 17th century life was no exception. Eleanor's world was tiny, a claustrophobic snow globe of interconnected families, and the human element was not a respite from her labor, but an extension of it. Every interaction was freighted with unspoken rules, potential judgment, and the constant, exhausting work of maintaining one's place in a brutally rigid social order. If you think your homeowners association is judgmental, you haven't seen anything yet. Let's start at the top of the food chain, the authorities. Your direct spiritual superior was the minister, a man whose primary qualification often seemed to be an encyclopedic knowledge of your personal and moral failings. He was not a gentle shepherd guiding his flock. He was a celestial auditor, and his job was to find discrepancies in your spiritual ledger. His sermons, delivered from a high pulpit that physically embodied his moral superiority, were not designed to comfort. They were weekly public performance reviews, where the entire village was informed, in thundering tones, of how thoroughly they were failing to please an omnipotent and perpetually disappointed God. His gaze from the pulpit was a physical weight, and a private word of concern from him about your family's piety could be a social death sentence. Then there were the secular masters, the town magistrates. These were the most prosperous men in the village, the ones with the most land, the biggest barn, the least starving-looking cows. They had seamlessly mistaken their good fortune for God's favor and their personal opinions for unimpeachable legal precedent. They settled disputes over wandering pigs, decreed the fines for swearing, and sat in judgment of their less successful neighbors with a grim, self-satisfied authority. An encounter with them was never a conversation between equals. It was an interrogation, a moment where your entire family's reputation was weighed, measured, and likely found wanting. And did anyone ever say, "Well done, Eleanor, for keeping 7 people alive through the winter on little more than boiled grain and sheer force of will"? Unlikely. Gratitude was a foreign currency, and praise was a sin of pride. Your reward for successfully navigating another year of back-breaking, life-sustaining labor was the continuation of that same existence, and the tacit approval of not being publicly shamed for failing. You weren't seen as a skilled, resilient woman. You were a piece of domestic infrastructure, as taken for granted as a barn door, and only ever noticed when you started to creak. Competence was the expected baseline. It was invisible. Failure, on the other hand, was a spectacle. But the most complex and dangerous relationships were with your peers, your fellow sufferers in this puritanical paradise. Your companions in this grand experiment of survival were a mixed and volatile bag. There was, of course, a grim sort of camaraderie, a bond forged in the crucible of shared misery. No one understood the tyranny of the butter churn, or the specific agony of a sick child in the dead of winter like another woman. These connections were your lifeline. They were built in moments of hushed conversation while mending clothes, in the shared labor of a harvest, in the vital exchange of herbal remedies and childbirth wisdom. A friend might lend you a cup of precious yeast when yours failed, or sit with you through a long and frightening night while a fever raged. These were acts of profound solidarity in a world that did everything to atomize you. Laughter, when it occurred, was a rare and precious thing, a harsh barking sound stripped of all frivolity, the gallows humor of the condemned, a brief shared acknowledgement of the absurdity of it all. But constant privation, fear, and the relentless pressure to conform could also turn people inward, or against each other. Every household was its own tiny, struggling kingdom, and the border disputes were frequent and bitter. The same neighbor who helped you last week might accuse your pig of breaking through a fence this week, a dispute that could fester into a multi-generational grudge. Envy was a poison that seeped into the very soil of the village. Did the Higgins family have a slightly fatter cow this year? Did the Putnams manage to harvest their corn before the first frost, while yours is still standing? In a world of such scarcity, your neighbor's good fortune could feel like a direct and personal insult from God. Gossip was the village's lifeblood and its most potent weapon. It was the internet, the newspaper, and the court of public opinion all rolled into one. At the village well or over a shared fence, information was traded like currency. Who was struggling with their finances? Whose daughter was seen talking a little too long with a young man? Whose husband was drinking more than his share? A woman's reputation, her good name, was her single most valuable asset, more precious than land or livestock. It could be built up over decades of piety and hard work, and utterly destroyed in an afternoon by a few well-placed venomous whispers. Everyone was a contributor to this system, and everyone was terrified of becoming its next victim. This fragile, volatile ecosystem of codependence and simmering resentment was the perfect breeding ground for what was to come. The social world of Salem was a landscape littered with dry tinder, old grudges, petty jealousies, financial disputes, and personal animosities. The afflicted girls and their accusations were not the start of the fire. They were merely the match. The people you borrowed sugar from were the exact same people who, with the right encouragement, would be willing to testify in front of a magistrate that your gaze had curdled their cream, that your spectral form had appeared at the foot of their bed, that the small kindnesses you showed them were not signs of friendship, but the cunning machinations of a servant of the devil. In our modern lexicon, luxury implies champagne, silk sheets, and time to do nothing. For Eleanor, the concept of luxury was far more fundamental. Luxury was a meal that didn't have weevils in it. Luxury was a roof that only leaked from one spot. Luxury was 3 consecutive hours of uninterrupted sleep. By these standards, she lived a life almost entirely devoid of anything approaching comfort. Let's debunk the myth of the cozy colonial cottage and examine the grim reality of her daily rewards. First, let's take a culinary tour of despair, also known as her daily diet. Dining in Eleanor's home was an experience best forgotten, but repeated 3 times a day. The main food groups were brown, beige, and boiled. The star of every meal, the pottage, was a culinary black hole from which no flavor could escape. It was a slurry of whatever grain was on hand, boiled with water and perhaps some sad, anemic-looking root vegetables, and simmered for hours over the fire until every ingredient had surrendered its individual identity into a uniform, grayish mush. Variety was not the spice of life. It was a rare and suspicious event. For a bit of texture, you might get a piece of salted meat. This wasn't a juicy chop. It was a piece of pork or beef that had been cured in a barrel of salt for months to preserve it. Preparing it required soaking it for hours to leach out the punishing level of salt. And even then, chewing it was a full-body workout. The bread, as we've mentioned, was a dense, weaponized biscuit designed to fill the stomach, not please the palate. As for seasoning, Spices like pepper or cinnamon were fantastically expensive, the stuff of wealthy merchants. Eleanor's primary seasonings were salt, if she was lucky, and soot, if she wasn't. And let's not even begin with hygiene. A few weevils in the flour weren't a cause for alarm. They were an unasked for and unavoidable source of protein. A fly taking a swim in the pottage was simply fished out. The water, drawn from a well that was often in dangerous proximity to the animal pen or the family latrine, was a game of bacterial roulette. You drank it and prayed your constitution was stronger than whatever invisible life forms were thriving in the bucket. The safest bet was often small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew that was aggressively undelicious but had been boiled during its creation, killing most of the microbial assassins. Now, where did she lay her weary head after a day of this gastronomic excitement? Let's talk about her sleeping quarters. The term bedroom is a generous one. It was more of a human storage facility. Privacy was a concept as alien as a day off. She, her husband, and their children all slept in the same 1 or 2 rooms, often sharing beds. The mattress was a coarse sack filled with straw or corn husks, which had all the orthopedic support of a bag of rocks. Over time, it would compress, absorb moisture, and become a thriving multi-species habitat for fleas, lice, bedbugs, and spiders. You didn't just sleep on your bed. You slept in it, with a whole host of tiny, unwelcome companions. The shelter itself was a sieve. You were less indoors, and more in a suggestion of a house. In winter, it was not uncommon to wake up with a fine dusting of snow on your blanket, blown in through the numerous cracks in the walls. The air was a permanent, damp chill that settled deep in your bones and made your clothes feel perpetually clammy. The floor, whether packed earth or splintered wood, was cold, filthy, and impossible to truly clean. It was a surface you shared with mice, who were not shy, and the occasional rat, whose scratching in the walls was another layer of the nightly soundscape. Which brings us to the final and most elusive luxury, rest. The notion that night was for 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep was a charming fairy tale. For Eleanor, sleep was a fragmented, precarious state, a series of desperate naps snatched between emergencies. If you weren't jolted awake by the agonizing throb of your protesting muscles, or a flea feasting on your ankle, there were plenty of other diversions. The baby would wake up crying, needing to be fed. A toddler would start coughing with a croupy bark that sent a spike of pure terror through your heart. A sudden gust of wind would rattle the shutters with a sound like the devil himself trying to get in, requiring an investigation. A commotion from the chicken coop could mean a fox was stealing your future meals, demanding you stumble out into the pitch-black cold. And through it all was the symphony of snoring, coughing and twitching from the other humans packed into the small space with you. Deep, restorative slumber was a rare and precious commodity, almost never acquired. This chronic sleep deprivation wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a form of slow torture. It frayed the nerves, crippled the spirit, and made the already monumental tasks of the following day feel utterly impossible. It left her in a permanent state of physical and mental exhaustion, running on fumes, with no hope of ever truly refueling. So when we picture Eleanor's life, we must erase the cozy, rustic imagery. Her food was joyless fuel. Her home was a leaky, vermin-infested box. Her rest was a battle she rarely won. This profound and unrelenting lack of basic comfort was the final, crushing layer of her daily existence, a constant state of misery that served as the grim stage upon which the true horror was about to unfold. So, for this lifetime of grinding labor, social navigation, and physical decay, surely Eleanor was well compensated, right? Perhaps she had a tidy savings, a pension plan, or at least a regular paycheck to show for it. Of course not. The concept of a regular payday involving clinking coin was, for most women in her position, a delightful fiction. Eleanor was a vital contributor to an incredibly complex economic unit known as the family farm. But she was compensated in a currency that was far more immediate and terrifying: survival. Her wages were the continued existence of herself and her children. Let's first understand their wealth. It wasn't kept in a bank, it was kept in the barn. Their net worth was measured in bushels of corn, barrels of salted fish, the health of their single milk cow, and the number of blankets they had to fend off the winter cold. This was not a liquid asset. It was perishable, vulnerable, and under constant threat. A fox in the henhouse wasn't just a nuisance. It was a devastating raid on the family's protein supply. A blight on the corn was the 17th century equivalent of a stock market crash. Their household budget had all the stability of a house of cards built on a trampoline during a mild earthquake. Hard currency, actual silver shillings and pence, was a rare and precious commodity. Most of the local economy ran on a complex, invisible, and deeply personal system of barter and credit. You wouldn't buy a new plow blade from the blacksmith. You would trade him a portion of your future harvest for it, or promise your husband would spend 3 days helping him clear a new field. This created a tangled web of obligations and debts that crisscrossed the entire village. Everyone owed something to someone else. This system worked, barely, but it was also a fertile breeding ground for resentment and disputes. A disagreement over the fairness of a trade or the exact amount of labor owed could poison a relationship for generations. And deductions. Oh, the creative accounting of a subsistence life. If a tool broke, the cost of replacing it came directly out of the family's survival fund. If a child got sick, the payment to the woman in the village who knew about herbal remedies might be a portion of your already meager cheese supply. Every single misfortune, big or small, was an immediate and painful deduction from their bottom line. Now, here is the grand cosmic irony that hangs over all of this. Eleanor personally had a net worth of precisely zero. Legally, she was little more than property herself. Any assets she brought into her marriage instantly became her husband's. She could not own land. She could not enter into a contract. She had no legal claim to the very products of her own endless labor. Think about it. She was the household's chief operations officer. She was the head of textile manufacturing, spinning wool and flax into thread and often weaving it into cloth. She was the director of dairy production, churning all the butter and cheese. She was the head of procurement and supply chain management, tending the garden and preserving its bounty. Her labor was the only thing that stood between her family and having to barter for every single candle, every bar of soap, every scrap of cloth. Her economic contribution was monumental. And for this pivotal role in the colonial economy, she was rewarded with a social status somewhere between a prized cow and a decent patch of dirt. She was a foundational, load-bearing pillar of the entire Massachusetts Bay Colony, and her payment was pottage and the right to not be exiled for impertinence. She moved a mountain of value through her hands every single day, yet her own pockets, had she any, would have contained nothing but lint and shattered dreams. Her already precarious existence was further buffeted by the whims of powers far beyond her control. The royal governor in Boston, or the king himself across the ocean, would levy taxes. These often had to be paid in hard currency, forcing her husband into difficult trades, selling precious grain or livestock for a pittance to raise the cash. Or the tax would be in kind, a mandatory contribution from their harvest, which was a direct tax on their ability to eat. Furthermore, the entire region was still living in the shadow of King Philip's War, a brutal and devastating conflict that had ended less than 20 years prior. The trauma, the economic disruption, and the deep-seated fear of the other were still raw. This, combined with political instability from England revoking the colony's charter, created a pervasive atmosphere of anxiety. People felt their entire world was under threat, their property insecure, their future uncertain. When people are this anxious and this economically fragile, they look for someone to blame. They look for scapegoats. A good harvest didn't make them rich. It just meant they might survive the winter with a bit less desperation. A bad harvest was a catastrophe. It meant debt. It meant appealing to the charity of neighbors who were just as bad off. It meant a winter of gnawing hunger and profound, terrifying insecurity. In this environment, the woman who lived on the edge of the village, the one whose cow had miraculously stayed healthy when others had sickened, or the one who had to beg for scraps to feed her children, both were objects of suspicion. Success and failure were equally dangerous. Eleanor's life was one of total economic vulnerability. She was an unrecognized engine in a machine she had no control over, living on a razor's edge, where the slightest gust of misfortune could send her entire world tumbling into ruin. It's no wonder that when the accusations started flying, they often landed on those who were already on the thinnest economic ice. In our world, we live by deadlines, by project end dates, by the satisfying moment of crossing an item off a to-do list. We crave closure. For Eleanor, this concept was a cruel joke. The concept of finishing for the day was a quaint notion, and finishing a journey was a milestone that only meant a new, equally arduous journey was about to begin. Her life wasn't a line with a beginning and an end. It was a circle. It was a monstrous, self-perpetuating cycle of toil, and she was sentenced to walk it until she dropped. The to-do list wasn't a piece of paper. It was the world itself, and it just said, "Suffer," repeated infinitely. You'd spend all day Monday engaged in the Herculean task of washing the family's clothes, hauling and heating water, scrubbing with harsh lye soap on a washboard until your knuckles were raw, wringing out heavy, waterlogged wool with your bare hands. You'd collapse into bed, exhausted but finished, only to wake up on Tuesday to the mending pile, now refreshed with the very clothes you just about killed yourself to clean. You'd mend the rips and patch the holes, only for those same garments to be worn, torn, and added back to next week's washing pile. It was a perfect closed loop of misery. This daily and weekly cycle was just a smaller gear in the great grinding machine of the seasons. The year was a wheel, and Eleanor was chained to it. Spring wasn't a time of gentle rebirth. It was a frantic, desperate scramble of planting. It was the back-breaking labor of clearing the fields of the rocks that seemed to magically grow back every single winter. Summer was not a vacation. It was a sweaty, pitched battle against weeds, insects, and drought, a constant effort to keep your food supply from being devoured by nature before you could be. Autumn was the great terrifying climax, the harvest. This was an all-hands-on-deck, race against the frost, work until you collapse frenzy to bring in everything that would keep you alive for the next 6 months. But finishing the harvest wasn't the end. No, that just started the next monumental phase, preservation. The endless, exhausting work of salting meat, drying apples, pickling vegetables, and storing grains, every task a bulwark against the coming death of the world. And winter? Winter was not a time of cozy rest. It was the great reckoning. It was a cold, dark, claustrophobic prison sentence where your main job was to not die. The work moved indoors, to the endless, mind-numbing spinning, weaving, and mending, all performed in the smoky half-light of the cabin. And all the while, you would watch your magnificent autumn hoard, the product of a year's worth of brutal labor, slowly, inexorably dwindle. Progress wasn't moving forward. It was simply managing to end the winter with just enough food left to have the strength to start the whole agonizing cycle all over again. There was no escape from this wheel. Where would you go? There was no moving to another town for a better job. There was no concept of retirement, no selling the farm and moving to a sunny pasture in Florida. Her life was tethered to this plot of land, this community, this husband. Her own biology was another trap. the relentless cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and nursing running concurrently with the seasons for decades. Even her faith was designed to keep her on the wheel. This life of unceasing toil wasn't seen as a misfortune. It was a divine feature. It was a test, a way to beat the sin of idleness out of you. To wish for rest was to exhibit pride. To complain was to question the very wisdom of God. You were a cog in his great, unforgiving machine, destined to turn until you broke. It would be an insult to suggest that Eleanor's life contained anything approaching joy in the modern sense. Yet it would be equally wrong to assume it was a completely uniform gray landscape of misery. Even in the deepest, darkest pit of daily suffering, the human spirit has a stubborn, almost stupid insistence on finding tiny, improbable cracks of light. These weren't moments of happiness. They were moments of profound, grim satisfaction. It was the flicker of professional pride in a job executed perfectly against all odds. It was the sight of the winter woodpile, stacked with geometric precision, a solid, beautiful fortress against the coming cold. It was the quiet thrill of seeing a loaf of bread rise perfectly by the hearth. It was the moment after hours of churning, when the butter finally came, a small, clean victory against the chaos of the universe. It was the deep, unspoken satisfaction of a perfectly mended seam, a tiny act of order and restoration in a world that constantly fell apart. This wasn't joy. It was the quiet, fierce pride of competence, a private acknowledgement that you were good at the hard business of staying alive. And sometimes, very rarely, a moment of genuine awe could pierce the veil of toil. The sight of 1,000 geese honking their way south against a sky painted in shades of impossible orange and purple. The absolute profound silence that fell after a heavy snow, covering the muddy, messy world in a blanket of pristine, temporary perfection. The clean, earthy smell of the first spring rain on thirsty ground. These moments didn't pay the bills or ease the ache in your back, but they were a reminder of a world larger than your own suffering, a world of divine artistry that existed beyond the judgment of the minister or the demands of the farm. These weren't moments of happiness. They were tiny, gasping breaths in an ocean of suffocation. They were not a cure for the misery, but they were, perhaps, what made enduring it possible. They were the small human sparks that the coming darkness was determined to extinguish completely. A king can pass down a crown. A merchant can pass down a fortune. What was Eleanor's legacy? What did she have to hand to the next generation? She had no gold, no land, no title. Her inheritance was the yoke itself. It was a legacy of calloused hands, an aching back, and a deep institutional knowledge of suffering. And the most heartbreaking part is that she had to pass it down herself, ensuring the very cycle that consumed her would continue, uninterrupted, through her own children. You didn't choose this life, and chances are, neither would your daughter. As your own strength began its slow, inexorable wane, you'd look at your girl, perhaps 10 or 12 years old, and a complex, bitter brew of emotions would churn in your gut. First, there was grim necessity. She had to learn. The family's survival depended on the continuity of labor. But this necessity was followed by a wave of profound, unspoken guilt. The knowledge that you were personally responsible for shackling her to the same leaking barge of a life that you were trapped on. Every lesson was another link in the chain. When you showed her how to properly knead the dense bread dough, you were also teaching her the perpetual ache that would one day live in her shoulders. When you corrected her clumsy stitching, your voice sharper than you intended, you were initiating her into a lifetime of eye-straining work by faint, flickering light. Your words were sharp not because your heart was cruel, but because the world was crueler. And there was no time for gentle instruction when winter was always just around the corner. A spoiled batch of soap or a poorly preserved ham weren't learning opportunities. They were threats of disease and hunger. You were teaching her to survive, but you were also teaching her the precise dimensions of her cage. And from her perspective, the dawning understanding was a quiet horror. She would look at your hands, your magnificent ruined hands, not with a child's pity, but with a terrifying sense of foreshadowing. She was looking at her own future. The way you moved, with a permanent stoop, the way you groaned softly when you stood up from the hearth. These were not just your pains. They were a preview of hers. The awe she once had for your seemingly magical abilities to create food and warmth was slowly being replaced by the dreadful, adult understanding that it wasn't magic. It was a life sentence of unrelenting work. Meanwhile, the river of time, that cruel and relentless current, was collecting its debts from your own body. The decline wasn't sudden. It was a slow, humiliating erosion. That chronic winter cough now rattled in your chest through the summer. The arthritis that once just made your knuckles ache now sent searing bolts of pain up your arm, making the simple act of gripping a pail an exercise in pure agony. Your eyes, after decades of squinting in the smoky darkness, began to betray you. Threading a needle, once a simple task, became a blurry, 10-minute battle of frustration. The younger women, your own daughter among them, would start to outpace you. They could lift the heavier pots, work longer in the fields during harvest without stopping. In the tight, pragmatic calculus of the household, your value began to depreciate. The gaze of your husband and your community would shift subtly. It was no longer the look given to a vital piece of machinery, but the calculating look one gives a worn-out tool. Can it be repaired? Or is it time for it to be replaced? There was no pension plan in 17th century Salem. There was no concept of a graceful retirement. When you could no longer pull your weight, you didn't get to rest. You became a burden. You became another mouth to feed without the hands to earn it. Your retirement plan was to hope that the children you had raised, the ones you had personally sentenced to this life, would have enough resources and enough lingering affection to keep you from starving. This physical decline and slide into dependency was a social death that often preceded the physical one. For a widow or a woman whose children had moved away, it was a particularly terrifying precipice. To be old, infirm, and alone was to be entirely reliant on the charity of a community that had precious little to spare. You became a ghost at the edge of the village, a hunched figure in black, a drain on the collective resources. It is no coincidence that so many of the women first cried out against in 1692 were older, poor, and seen as a burden. Their economic and physical obsolescence made them easy, disposable targets. The ultimate tragedy for Eleanor was this convergence. The moment her own body was truly beginning to fail was the exact moment she had to ensure her daughter was fully prepared to take her place. She was forced to be the architect of her own replacement, the foreman in charge of constructing the next generation of laborer. It was the final, cruel turn of the wheel, a legacy of misery, passed down not out of malice, but out of grim, heartbreaking, and inescapable necessity. The famous men of the age, the Mathers, the Hathorns, the Phipps, their names are carved into the stone of history. They wrote the books, preached the sermons, signed the death warrants. They built the intellectual and legal framework of their society, and we remember them for it. They stand as the great granite obelisks in the graveyard of the past. But beneath the shadow of every single one of those obelisks lies the unrecorded, uncelebrated, and unending labor of countless women like Eleanor. She wore no crown and wrote no sermon. Her name was not chiseled into the cornerstone of a new church. Her stage was the smoky confines of a one-room house. Her great work was not a theological treatise. It was a mended shirt, a pot of pottage, a sleeping child. And yet, without her, and the million others just like her, the entire colonial enterprise would have guttered out like a cheap candle in a stiff breeze, She was the unseen ant, laboring tirelessly to build the mountain upon which the great men stood and declared themselves kings of the hill. She was the producer of the most essential commodities in any civilization: food, clothing, and people. Without her relentless, monotonous toil, the grand experiment of a city upon a hill would have collapsed into a muddy, starving, disease-ridden failure within a generation. She was the literal lifeblood of the society that, in its moment of madness, would turn and devour her. No statues were ever raised in her honor. Her name, if it survives at all, is found in the grim ledger of a court proceeding, misspelled and defined only by the ludicrous crime she was accused of. Her thoughts, her fears, her fleeting moments of grim satisfaction, all have long since dissolved into the unforgiving New England soil. Yet her legacy is everywhere, hidden in plain sight. It is in the very fact that the colony survived. It is in the bread that fed the builders, the thread that clothed the soldiers, the children that populated the future. She and her sisters in suffering were the anonymous current, the deep, powerful motive force that allowed the ship of the colony, captained by men whose names we all know, to move forward at all. She didn't just witness history from the sidelines. She was the one down in the galley, pulling the oars. Her contribution utterly essential and completely ignored. So, the next time you read about the Salem witch trials, the next time you hear the story of the afflicted girls, the spectral evidence, and the hanging judges, spare a thought for the forgotten woman at the center of it all. Remember the life we have detailed here. Remember the aching back, the ruined hands, the constant grinding exhaustion that was her reality before the first finger was ever pointed. Remember that she was not just a symbol, not just a victim in a theological horror story. She was a master of 1,000 difficult trades, a manager of scarce resources, a veteran of a lifelong war against entropy and starvation. Her endurance was breathtaking. Her resilience, in the face of it all, was a quiet miracle. She sought no glory and received only infamy. Yet, in her unceasing labor, in her stubborn refusal to break under the soul-crushing weight of her world, she was more than just a sufferer. She was a fundamental part of the great unseen engine that powered a civilization. Her name is forgotten, condemned to the footnotes of a tragedy. But her collective contribution, the silent, stubborn legacy of 1,000,000 women just like her, is the bedrock upon which a nation was built.